أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. We begin in the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'm your host, and this is another edition of Ramadan is Young. Today, inshallah, we're going to talk about a very important topic in Ramadan that is covered. It is Al-Quran. And I begin with a verse in the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in a verse, He says, شهر رمضان الذي أنزل فيه القرآن هدى للناس وبينات من الهدى والفرقان. And this means in the month of Ramadan, in which the Quran was sent down as a guidance to the people, as self-evident proof of that guidance, and by a standard in which you can discern between the false and the truth. This is in Surah al-Baqarah, verse 185. Here we're going to look at in-depth, look at this verse, and look at the history of Quran in Ramadan, and at the same time, at the end, some practical points that we can walk away with. One of the most important parts of the Quran that talks about how Quran can be a guidance, this is what it says in the verse, that this to be a guidance, is in the beginning of Surah al-Baqarah, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala starts off with, Alif Lam Mim, ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ هُدًى لِلْمُتَّقِينَ الذين يؤمنون بالغيب ويقيمون الصلاة ومما رزقناهم ينفقون والذين يؤمنون بما أنزل إليك وما أنزل من قبلك وبالآخرة هم يوقنون أولئك على هدى من ربهم وأولئك هم المفلحون. And here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is showing us in that verse, he starts off and says, this book is a guidance. This book is from Alif Lam Mim. This book is there is no doubt in it or twistedness in this verse, and it is a guidance for those who are muttaqun. Again, dealing that word with taqwa that we spoke about, and then it goes on to describe the different characteristics that who this book is a guide for. And here he covers 5 important areas, and this is very important because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying this book is a guidance for those who believe, those who have, for those who have taqwa, muttaqun, who believe in that which is beyond human perception, ilm al-ghaib. This is what it means. It means those who believe in things that are beyond what they can perceive in their senses. And that's a very powerful point because Allah is saying, look man, you need to have these qualities in order for this Quran to be a guidance for you. So he starts with this quality, that belief in ilm al-ghaib, that we believe in things beyond our perception. This is a very important point. And then he says, who are also constant in prayer, or in other words, establish prayer, qimus salat, which means to establish the prayer, to be constant in prayer. It doesn't mean, at times people say, oh, this is an element that you bring into your life as something that's consistent, and you establish it. Some scholars also say that it refers to wherever you go, you establish the Salah. You establish the remembrance of Allah wherever you go, in your office, in your home. If you go, you're in the West, wherever you're at, you pull up to the roadside and you establish Salah. And you're constant in it. This is another quality that is required for this book to be a guidance. In order for this book to be a guidance, you need to have this quality as a part of you. Who spend on others out of what we have provided for them in their rizq. What we have provided, who spend on others, who believe in that which is bestowed on the Prophet ﷺ, the Quran, and those before him. It's a very important point too. And those before him, where they call, like for example, Imam Shafi refers to the term Ahl al-Kitab, that it says in the Quran, that it says people of the book. This is referring to people, not just the Jews and Christians, but anybody who had a book and a messenger before Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And we know all these books spoke about one message, Islam. Later on, these things got corrupted by the people and the practices and so forth. So you have to believe in these books. This is the 4th point. And the 5th point, he says, who believe in the life to come. And these 5 points, in order for this book to be a guidance for you, you're required to have these 5 points. So if you read Surah al-Baqarah, verse 1 through 5, it will show you these 5 points. Allah is saying, look, in order for this book to be a guidance, you need to have these 5 things. And if you're missing something, Quran cannot be a full guidance for you. You're missing an aspect of it. And I always share with people, one of the difficult things dealing with, especially in the West, with atheists, is the idea that when you speak about Islam and Dawah, they said, prove it to us. Because they limit themselves to this standard of tangibility. If you can't prove it to us, and we cannot sense it in our own senses, our 5 senses, we can't taste it, touch it, smell it, understand it even in the 6th sense. They said if there's no tangible proof of God's existence, then we cannot believe. But here Allah is saying this book can never be a guidance for these people because they don't believe in things beyond their perception. And that's a very important thing, because when you think of yourself as an arrogant person, that I can look and understand and feel everything, and if you can't explain it to me that way, it doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. And there's a beautiful topic on this. I don't want to get further lost in it, but the point I'm trying to get at is you need to have these 5 qualities in order for this Quran to be a guidance for you. Allah is saying that. And so we look at the other aspect that he speaks about in this verse is al-Furqan. He describes the Quran as a distinguisher between false and the truth. And he describes this, the relationship, also another place in the Quran. He says, truth is so powerful that it'll knock the brains of falsehood. And that is the reality of it, that here this Quran has come to be a distinguisher between what was false and what is truth in general and in specific. Meaning that before, what you just mentioned about these books that came, we know that in these books there have been corruption. And you can look at any of the texts. And I've done a lot of personal religious study, interreligious study, and when you read the text of these religions across the world, you see different versions. That in itself should show you, okay, how in the world does this holy book have 200 versions? And in these 200 versions, you have so many variations. And if all of these are the same word from God, then how is it so many different words and so many different angles? And someone has changed this here and someone has changed that here. That is a sign in itself of the corruption that has happened in these texts. And the Quran, alhamdulillah, is one that does not have such a thing. As we know from the saying of Prophet ﷺ, that Allah has promised him to protect this book until the end of time. And inshallah, we can do our part in the hifazat, and by memorizing the Quran, by reading the Quran, and keeping it alive in our lives, in practice. And so, al-Furqan, this is one of the qualities of the Quran, that it distinguishes between falsehood and truth in general, and also specifically when it deals with the books and words of Allah that have come in the past. So you can take the Quran, you could compare it with the Bible, with the Torah, with the Rig Veda even, of the Hindus, with the religious books of the Zoroastrians that's still around. With all these books that have come from before, Allah knows best about the reality of it, but you could take what is in line with the Quran and reject all else, because Quran is showing you what is the truth. And there was truth there at one point, but it got corrupted. And then that's something that we can take from this lesson of al-Furqan. And of course there's a more in-depth discussion, but just as a note that Furqan is this farq, the difference. This al-Furqan, the criterion, as some people translate. This is a criterion to judge by. So inshallah, without that, we go into the history of the Quran in Ramadan, and just some small points. We know that the Prophet ﷺ used to recite the Quran in Ramadan, and he used to recite it to Angel Gabriel. And through that, he would verify what was revealed to him, if it was verified right, and he would recite it back. And we know in the last Ramadan of his life, he recited the Quran twice. And the reason is he wanted to make sure that in the full, complete form, the Quran has arrived, and he has completed his duty as a messenger to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and has given this message, al-Quran, in its perfect form. And we also know later on in the time period of Umar radiallahu anhu, when he became the caliph, when he became the leader of the Muslims, Amir al-Mu'mineen, and he observed one time when he came in the prayer hall, into the masjid, he's seen all these people, they're praying and reading Quran, but they're reading it all separately. And he said, why not everybody read together? And he got one imam, and he put him ahead, and he said, you lead the prayer and read the Quran for everybody. This way, there will be no confusion, because all this mixing, and you have it sometimes where you go and you see all these people reading Quran and there's mixing and there's messing up. And the Quran should be a place where it should be read with respect, and when it is recited, you show respect. And so therefore, he felt this, and he even commented that this is a good bid'ah in a different light, from an innovation that is evil. And he said that this is something that is good for the people, and it was, and we see it now, that this effect has occurred even to our time now, that Taraweeh prayer is done in the masjids, and there's one imam, and we pray behind him, and there's unition in it, there's a brotherhood in it, and so this is a very important thing, that the Quran was recited in the prayers, and this was something from that time, even before, but he brought it into unition. And so, we read at some of the points, like, what are some of the practical points dealing with the Quran? Like, for example, how often should I read it? And, Imam Ahmad and Imam Ishaq ibn Ruwah, they recommend that it should be read within 40 days. And they say that from a narration of a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. And some say, it should be in a month. This is another narration of the Prophet ﷺ dealing with that. And really the idea is that, you should take that this is not a minimum for everybody. Sometimes we have new Muslims, sometimes we have young Muslims who are encouraging and, getting involved in the deen. And too much is too heavy sometimes, you take it in piecemeal. And Ibn Masud radiallahu anhu, he recommended that when they were companions and they would study the Prophet ﷺ, they would take 10 verses a day. 10 verses a day. So some say that this should be a bare minimum, that start with 10 verses a day. And so this is something that we should reflect on. We're at different levels. And if you can, complete the Quran in 30 days. But if you can't, and you understand someone, hey, he's new Muslim, I don't want to overburden him, you recommend something that they can deal with. And this is something, Islam is very flexible like this. And one thing we have to be careful about is don't get too much, and like I said, make it so that you forget the Quran. If you miss the Quran once a day and you don't even recite one verse or remember one verse, then you have a problem. You have come to the bare minimum to nothing. So you should at least, as a minimum, do one verse a day, regardless of Ramadan. And Ramadan, of course, it should be extra. And we're remembering this Quran because the Quran was revealed in Ramadan, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says. And as such, we should remember it, especially in this month. But in general, at least one ayah a day, as a bare minimum. If that's where you have to start, then start there and work your way up. And come to the minimum recommendation of Ibn Masud, 10 verses a day. And work yourself up and recite Quran in 30 days. And if you can do more, recite Quran in 10, in 7. And so alhamdulillah, we're at different paces, and where we are in our lives and where we can struggle, that's where we can reach. So the other practical point I wanted to cover is that how should we read? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, He says, كِتَابٌ أَنزَلْنَاهُ إِلَيْكَ مُبَارَكٌ لِيَتَدَبَّرُوا آيَاتِهِ وَلِتَذَكَّرُوا أُولُو الْأَلْبَابِ. It is a book that we have sent down to you, blessed, so that you may contemplate its verses and so that the people of understanding may take heed. As Surah 38, verse 29. So that you may contemplate its verses and so that the people may take heed. And this is very interesting, is that Allah is telling you, meditate on these verses. Do not just read them, do not just memorize them. The true preservation of the Quran is in actual practice of what it is. And there's a famous saying that a man who memorizes 100 verses, is he better than the man who memorizes one verse but puts it in practice, where the man that memorized 100 verses doesn't put one in practice? So it comes to the true hifazat of the Quran, the true hufaz of the Quran, the true preservers of the Quran, who put the Quran in practice. As Aisha radiallahu anha described the Prophet ﷺ in one nutshell, she said, he is as he is the walking Quran. So this is something for us to reflect on. And we also look at the practical elements, like, hey, what should I recommend in aspect of just reading the Quran, or should I read it with meaning? Of course you should read it with meaning. Of course, most of our English listeners, there's alhamdulillah plenty of English translations. And some would recommend it. That personally, I would recommend Muhammad Asad's Message to the Quran. I've read a lot of English translations, and some of the best English that I've seen is in this the Message of the Quran by Muhammad Asad. And I recommend that. And of course, there's many others. And look to that, and you should read it with meaning, with understanding, so that you can put it into practice. And so also, beyond this, if you have time in Ramadan, and of course we have to set aside time as well, get into the tafsir. Begin to read the tafsir. And there's, alhamdulillah, so many translations going on, and that so many brothers and sisters are out there, fi sabilillah, doing this translation work. I mean, the great classics are almost all translated into English, and Tafsir ibn Kathir, you can get in multiple versions. There's many translations, actually, of Tafsir ibn Kathir in English. You can get this, and you can get Maulana Maududi's Tafsir. This is another one that is translated, and it's very beneficial. And I recommend you start with one of these two as a beginning starter point. And of course, there's many, many other tafsirs that have come out, and you can always gain from that. But start somewhere with tafsir. Tafsir is a deep understanding of what the Quranic verse says, the history behind the revelation of the verse, some narrations dealing with the verse of the Prophet ﷺ explaining these verses, some narrations of the companions, some narrations from the scholars who will give you a great in-depth understanding, and open your mind. The Quran is such a beautiful thing, it's like a miraculous thing, and one of the miracles is that every time even I recite it, in every Ramadan, it'll be as if I read a verse as if I never read it before. And it's very funny because this is the same thing that happened in the time of the death of the Prophet ﷺ. That when he passed away, the people were so in awe and shock that it's impossible. The Prophet ﷺ couldn't have passed away. And Umar radiallahu anhu said, man, if anybody says anything, I'm going to kill him with my sword, because this is not the truth. He didn't want to believe it. And Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu was the calmest of them all, and he said, listen, did you not hear the verse in Surah Al Imran, verse 144? And in there he explains this. It says that basically, if the Prophet ﷺ would die, would you back away and step away from Allah too? I'm paraphrasing in a nutshell, and the people said, when he said that, and they remembered that verse, it was as if they had never heard it. It was as if they never heard it. He said, man, I used to read the Quran 100 times, and when he read this verse to me, it was as if I never heard it. And then the truth hit Umar radiallahu anhu, and he started crying. So that's the experience that I have, that sometimes when I read the Quran, in fact, every time I read the Quran in Ramadan, I always get this with one verse. I'm like, man, it was as if I never read it before. So in conclusion today, I leave you with the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. He says, recite the Quran, for on the day of resurrection, it shall come as an intercessor for you. It shall speak on your behalf. And we need all the intercession that we need on that day, when there shall be no intercession except for the intercession that Allah allows. And so, on that note, happy reading in the Quran. Ramadan is young, and inshallah we can finish our recitation of the Quran this month and gain something from it that we never got before. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.